Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria is one of the most controversial and complex stories in modern geopolitics. To understand how a leader who once held tight control over his nation found himself facing armed rebellion, we need to start with the foundations of his rule and the environment that made such a dramatic shift possible. For years, Syria was ruled with an iron grip. Bashar al-Assad, inheriting the presidency from his father, Hafez al-Assad, maintained the same authoritarian style of governance. The Assad family had firm control over the military, the economy, and, most importantly, the political system. On the surface, Syria seemed stable, but underneath there were cracks, deep dissatisfaction among segments of the population, rampant corruption, and limited economic opportunity for the average citizen. When the Arab Spring began to sweep across the Middle East in 2011, it wasn't just a wave of protests. It was a tidal shift that threatened to drown regimes that had been untouchable for decades. Tunisia and Egypt showed the world what could happen when enough people stood up. This momentum reached Syria, where protests began as peaceful demonstrations demanding greater freedoms and reforms. However, Assad's response was brutal. His regime viewed the protests as an existential threat. Security forces cracked down with violence, arresting and killing demonstrators. Instead of quelling the unrest, this approach poured gasoline on the fire. What started as peaceful protests spiraled into a full-blown civil war. Now, here's where the story becomes even more complicated. The opposition to Assad was not a single unified group. Initially, it consisted of local militias, defectors from Assad's army, and moderate political activists. But as the conflict grew, it attracted a new set of players: radical Islamist groups like al-Nusra Front and eventually ISIS. These groups didn't just have ideological motives. They saw the chaos in Syria as an opportunity to carve out territories and establish control. Let's take a step back to consider the role of external players. While Assad received support from Russia and Iran, the rebels were also receiving aid. And not just from one country. This was a geopolitical tug-of-war. Nations like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia funneled money, weapons, and resources to various rebel groups. But this wasn't charity. Each nation had its reasons. Turkey, for example, sought to weaken Assad, partly to curb Kurdish influence near its border. The Kurdish groups in Syria were gaining ground during the conflict, and Turkey viewed them as a direct threat to its national security. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia and Qatar were locked in a broader rivalry with Iran, and saw the Syrian Civil War as a way to reduce Iranian influence in the region. This foreign intervention created a patchwork of rebel factions, each with different goals and sponsors. You had groups that wanted to establish a democratic Syria, but you also had factions motivated by extremist ideologies. These groups didn't always work together. In fact, they often fought each other as much as they fought Assad's forces. Now imagine being an ordinary Syrian caught in the middle of this chaos. On one side, you had a regime that bombed its own cities to suppress rebellion. On the other, rebel groups that might promise freedom, but were often divided and unpredictable. For many, survival became the only goal. Millions fled, leading to one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. If we look specifically at the role of Turkey, their involvement went beyond merely supporting rebel factions. Turkey also hosted millions of Syrian refugees, which gave them leverage in negotiations with Europe. By controlling the flow of refugees into Europe, Turkey could use the crisis as a bargaining chip in political and economic discussions. This shows just how intertwined domestic and international interests became in the Syrian conflict. But let's talk about the hypothetical scenario of Assad falling entirely to these rebel forces, many of which included extremist groups. What would that mean for Syria? The fall of a regime doesn't necessarily mean the rise of stability. Look at Libya after the ousting of Gaddafi. What followed was chaos. Various factions competing for control with no clear leadership to unify the country. In Syria, the situation would likely have been even more complex. Rebel groups backed by different nations would have pushed for dominance. Radical factions might have gained control over key areas, turning Syria into a hotbed for global terrorism. And remember, the people of Syria would still face immense suffering. Infrastructure destroyed by years of war wouldn't rebuild itself overnight. Economic recovery would take decades, especially with so many young people either dead, displaced, or radicalized by years of conflict. Furthermore, the fall of Assad wouldn't just affect Syria. It would create ripples across the Middle East and beyond. Iran, losing a key ally, might escalate its regional activities to compensate. Turkey, now bordering a chaotic failed state, would face heightened security threats. And Europe, already struggling with refugee inflows, could see an even greater surge, straining resources and fueling political tensions. It's important to understand that there are no simple solutions in conflicts like these. The Syrian Civil War isn't just a battle between good and evil. It's a clash of interests, ideologies, and power dynamics. Every actor, whether it's Assad, the rebels, or foreign nations, has their agenda, and often it's the ordinary people who suffer the most. As we close, let's reflect on what this conflict teaches us about geopolitics. Nations don't intervene in foreign wars out of kindness. Every decision is calculated, aimed at gaining influence or securing interests. And when external players get involved in civil wars, it rarely ends well for the country at the center of it. Syria is a tragic example of how a nation can become a battleground for global power struggles, leaving its people to bear the brunt of the devastation. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.